The chamber fell silent as Representative Jasmine Crockett took the podium, her eyes fixed with laser-like intensity on her target. The Trump administration's first 100 days of power. The stakes were clear. A Democratic champion confronting policies that threatened to dismantle Black Americans' rights, from education to housing to economic opportunity. Her words would expose the systematic rollback of civil rights protections that many had feared but few had articulated so directly. This wasn't just another congressional speech. It was an indictment of an administration accused of turning back the clock on racial justice. Stay with us. This confrontation will define America's path forward. The House chamber stretched before her like a vast battlefield, its historic walls bearing silent witness to centuries of political combat. Crystal chandeliers cast a harsh, unforgiving light down upon the polished wood rostrum where Representative Crockett now stood, their brilliance reflecting off the glossy surface of the desk with an almost accusatory intensity. The Democratic side of the aisle was filled with attentive faces, leaning forward slightly, while the Republican section maintained a deliberately indifferent posture, some members scrolling through phones or shuffling papers. The C-SPAN cameras positioned strategically throughout the chamber captured every nuance, every subtle shift in expression. Red recording lights blinked steadily, broadcasting this moment to millions of Americans who would witness this confrontation from living rooms across the country. The gallery above was filled with spectators, their collective breath held in anticipation. Representative Crockett stood alone at the podium, a striking figure in a tailored royal blue suit that seemed to radiate authority. Her eyes, clear and unwavering, surveyed the chamber with a measured gaze that betrayed none of the fury she harbored within. Her fingers lightly gripped the edges of the podium, not for support, but as if to channel the strength flowing through her. The microphone before her waited to amplify the words that would soon pierce the artificial calm of the chamber. The air conditioning hummed a monotonous backdrop to the tension, its steady drone attempting to cool the heated emotions permeating the space. Outside these walls, a nation divided waited. Inside, the battlefield was set. At precisely 2:17 p.m., when the Speaker of the House acknowledged her time to speak, Jasmine Crockett drew a quiet breath, the kind warriors take before charging into battle. The atmosphere in the chamber shifted imperceptibly as Representative Crockett leaned into the microphone. Her voice, measured yet resonating with authority, cut through the artificial calm like a perfectly honed blade. "Mr. Speaker," she began, a formal address that belied the storm about to be unleashed. The narrator's voice now lowers, almost conspiratorial, as if sharing a sacred truth with the audience. It had been exactly 100 days since President Trump had returned to power. 100 days of what many in this chamber, and indeed across the nation, viewed as systematic dismantling of hard-won progress. Representative Crockett was not here for platitudes or political niceties. The set of her jaw, the steady intensity in her eyes, these betrayed her mission today. She came armed with truth, and truth was her only weapon. Crockett's opening remarks fell upon the chamber with precision and purpose. Without raising her voice, she didn't need to. She cut through pretense and addressed what she viewed as the heart of the matter. A president who, in her assessment, failed to understand the most fundamental aspects of his office. The phrase cosplaying as the next pope hung in the air, causing several Democratic staffers to suppress knowing smiles, while Republican members stiffened in their seats, their expressions hardening into masks of defensive indignation. Her reference to the oath of office, that sacred promise to protect and defend the Constitution, landed like a gauntlet thrown upon the chamber floor. Even those who disagreed with her politically could not help but register the gravity of the accusation. Was she suggesting the president had violated his oath? The implication was clear, and it electrified the room. As Crockett continued, invoking the Declaration of Independence, some Republican members exchanged glances, a silent communication of dismissal. But others, particularly the younger members, could not help but be drawn in by her oratorical skill, the way she wove foundational American principles into her critique. When she spoke of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness belonging to all Americans, her right hand lifted slightly, palm upward, as if physically elevating these inalienable rights above the partisan fray. The cameras caught it all, the subtle shift in her posture as she leaned forward, the momentary flash of emotion in her eyes when she spoke of entitlement to rights, not as a request, but as a fundamental American birthright. Even those who had entered the chamber, determined to dismiss her words, found themselves listening, if only to formulate counters to her arguments. The power of her presence commanded attention, whether willingly given or grudgingly conceded. The chamber temperature seemed to rise as Representative Crockett transitioned from philosophical foundations to concrete accusations. Her voice took on a new quality, not louder, but somehow deeper, weighted with the gravity of her charges against the administration. Havoc, she called it. Pain, she named it. And as she did, staffers in the back rows could be seen nodding almost imperceptibly, their professional neutrality momentarily cracked by recognition. This administration clearly is not ready to lead, she asserted, and the words hung in the air like a verdict already rendered. They are only here to tear down. Republican members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Papers rustled with perhaps more force than necessary, a physical manifestation of their disagreement. Yet none interrupted. To do so would acknowledge the power of what was being said. When Crockett invoked the specter of Project 2025, a visible ripple moved through the chamber. Democrats sat straighter, their expressions a mixture of vindication and concern, while several Republican members studied their notes with sudden intensity, avoiding the direct gaze of the cameras that had swiveled toward them. The controversial blueprint for governance, once dismissed by some as alarmist fiction, now stood accused in the formal record as the operational manual for an administration barely 3 months into its term. Let's talk about education, Crockett continued, her tone shifting to something more intimate, as if personally inviting each listener into a difficult but necessary conversation. The tactical brilliance of this approach was undeniable. Her opponents found themselves engaged before they could erect their defenses. As she detailed the Department of Education's quiet rescinding of guidance encouraging inclusive Black history, her left hand rose, index finger extending as if pointing directly at the invisible architects of this policy shift. The phrase whitewash history landed with particular force, causing one senior Republican congressman to close his eyes briefly, either in dismissal or, perhaps more telling, to mask a reaction he didn't wish captured by the ever-present cameras. Crockett's description of patriotic education dripped with such precise sarcasm that it required no additional emphasis. The term itself, in her mouth, became its own indictment. When she spoke of executive orders reinstating common-sense discipline practices in schools, her fingers formed air quotes that transformed the seemingly innocuous phrase into something sinister. The racial disparities in school discipline were not an abstract concept in this moment. They were made flesh in the very presence of this Black congresswoman standing before the nation, articulating the cost of policies that would disproportionately impact children who looked like her. These decisions have a direct impact on Black children, she declared, and the simplicity of this truth rendered rebuttals momentarily impossible. The camera caught a close-up of her face as she said, "Children who deserve a fair shot." And in that instant, her political armor slipped just enough to reveal the mother, the protector, the human being who recognized that beyond policy debates were real lives, real futures hanging in the balance. This flickering moment of raw humanity amid the clinical proceedings served only to amplify her authority, not diminish it. "Let's talk about housing," Crockett continued, her tactical shift as deliberate as a chess master advancing pieces across the board. Her voice maintained its measured cadence, but now carried an undercurrent of restrained outrage that vibrated through the chamber. The strategic brilliance of her approach was becoming clear. Methodically, she was building a comprehensive case, not of isolated incidents, but of a coordinated assault on the foundations of equality. As she detailed HUD's plans to gut fair housing rules, several Democratic members nodded in grim confirmation. One older black congressman in the third row closed his eyes momentarily, as if physically pained by the reminder of how cyclical these battles had become. When Crockett made the connection to Trump's own history as a landlord who had violated these same rules, Republican staffers could be seen frantically scribbling notes, preparing counterpoints for the inevitable press inquiries that would follow. "This means there will be even more roadblocks for black families trying to buy a home," she stated, her right hand making a chopping motion that severed any attempt to disguise the policy's impact behind bureaucratic language. Yet another generation locked out of building wealth. The words fell like stones into still water, ripples of uncomfortable truth, spreading through the chamber. A White House liaison seated near the back straightened his tie and avoided eye contact with nearby journalists. The administration's official position was that these rule changes simply removed unnecessary regulatory burdens. But Crockett's framing, direct, unvarnished, and historically contextualized, made such clinical explanations sound hollow by comparison. When she pivoted to public safety, the atmosphere in the chamber grew even more charged. "Let's talk about public safety," she said, and a subtle shift occurred in her posture. Her shoulders squared further, her chin lifted almost imperceptibly. This was personal territory, not just for her, but for the communities she represented. The contradiction she outlined, cutting after-school programs while pouring millions into police militarization, laid bare what she clearly viewed as the administration's punitive rather than preventative approach to predominantly black neighborhoods. "They're criminalizing our communities while stripping away the very resources that keep us safe," she declared. The use of "our" did not go unnoticed. In this moment, Crockett was not merely a congresswoman fulfilling her professional obligations. She was explicitly standing as a member of the communities under assault. This dual position, both inside the power structure as a legislator and connected to those most vulnerable to its decisions, gave her words a resonance that purely political rhetoric could never achieve. The gallery above grew unusually still as this section of her address continued. Even those who had come to observe rather than participate found themselves pulled into the gravity of her narrative. A journalist in the press section could be seen putting down his pen, momentarily forgetting to take notes as he simply listened, the professional distance temporarily bridged by the undeniable humanity of what was being described. "And finally," Crockett continued, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "money talks. So let's talk money." The House chamber seemed to contract around her words, as if the very space recognized the shift from theoretical to tangible, from principles to practicalities. Several senior Republican members who had affected boredom during earlier portions of her speech now looked up, their attention captured by the universal language of fiscal policy. The narrator's voice drops to a confidential tone. Here was the battlefield where ideology met reality. The budget. No amount of rhetorical flourish could disguise which communities would bear the burden of funding decisions. Representative Crockett knew this, and she wielded this knowledge like a seasoned prosecutor presenting the most damning evidence last. As she detailed the slashing of funding across 7 government agencies that provided Black communities with educational materials and economic opportunities, a Democratic congresswoman in the second row shook her head slowly, her expression a mixture of resignation and resolve. These were not abstract cuts, but targeted excisions from the support systems that had enabled generations of progress against systemic obstacles. Crockett's mention of the Minority Business Development Agency, the only federal agency dedicated to uplifting minority businesses, carried particular weight. Her voice softened momentarily, becoming almost conversational as she connected the agency to entrepreneurs, including in my own district. This localization of national policy transformed statistics into stories, budget lines into livelihoods. Now it's under attack, she concluded, and the simplicity of this statement carried more accusatory power than any embellishment could have achieved. The camera caught a brief, unguarded moment as a Republican representative leaned over to whisper to his colleague. The colleague's response, a slight shrug and down-turned mouth, seemed to suggest that these particular cuts were difficult to justify even within their own ideological framework. The politics of austerity had collided with the politics of opportunity, and the contradiction was impossible to ignore. As Crockett expanded her indictment to include environmental justice, HBCU funding, and civil rights enforcement, her cadence accelerated slightly. Not rushed, but building momentum like a prosecutor moving toward conclusion. The cumulative effect of this catalog of cuts created a picture not of random budget decisions, but of a coordinated effort with specific targets and predictable consequences. "Let me repeat," she said, and the chamber grew silent in anticipation of what she deemed important enough to emphasize twice. "Rolling back civil rights enforcement across federal agencies." The repetition landed with calculated effect. No one in that chamber could misunderstand her meaning. This was not about efficiency or prioritization, but about the deliberate dismantling of protections established through decades of struggle. Her connection of these actions to DEI attacks, and ultimately to trying to roll back the Civil Rights Act of 1964, elevated the stakes beyond partisan politics. Invoking the landmark legislation, and those who had died and bled for its passage, placed the current administration's actions within a historical context that transcended the typical boundaries of political debate. This was not, in Crockett's framing, about policy disagreements, but about a fundamental moral regression. The chamber, momentarily, seemed suspended between eras, the battles of the past and the conflicts of the present merging into a single, continuous struggle. Even those who disagreed with her assessment could not help but feel the weight of the historical parallels she drew. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett continued, her voice now imbued with a quiet intensity that commanded more attention than any shout could have achieved. "This is not just about policy disagreement." The deliberate pause that followed allowed her words to expand and fill the chamber, forcing every person present to confront the moral framing she was establishing. This is about direct attacks on Black futures, Black prosperity, and Black freedom. Each repetition of Black landed with increasing emphasis, not through volume, but through the sheer force of her conviction. This is about right versus wrong, point blank. The simplicity of this moral dichotomy cut through layers of political complexity, stripping away the comfortable ambiguities that often shielded difficult conversations about race in America. A subtle but significant shift had occurred in the chamber. Where Crockett had begun as the interrogator, laying out evidence against an administration, she now stood as something else entirely. A voice of historical continuity, connecting present struggles to past resistance. The power dynamics within the room had imperceptibly realigned. Those who had sat in judgment of her words now found themselves implicitly judged by history itself. "But here's what they don't understand," she continued, and a new quality entered her voice. Not defiance, exactly, but something deeper, more assured. It was the confidence of someone who had studied the long arc of history and found patterns that offered both warning and hope. "We've seen this playbook before." As she spoke of resistance against attempts to silence us, erase us, and hold us down, several members of the Congressional Black Caucus straightened in their seats, their expressions reflecting a collective memory that transcended individual experience. This was not merely political rhetoric. It was lived reality, passed down through generations, and now finding voice in these hallowed chambers where decisions affecting millions were made daily. "They are trying to bury us," Crockett declared, her right hand now raised, index finger pointing upward in emphasis. "But what they don't realize is that we are seeds." The metaphor hung in the air, its potency undeniable. Several staffers could be seen quickly writing down the phrase, recognizing its immediate quotability and deeper resonance. "And still we rise," she added, the Maya Angelou reference requiring no citation for those who understood its significance. The camera panned across the chamber, capturing the varied reactions to this shift from indictment to affirmation. Some Republican members maintained carefully neutral expressions, their political training helping them mask whatever thoughts might be crossing their minds. Others displayed subtle signs of discomfort, a tightened jaw here, an averted gaze there, at being cast as antagonists in a narrative far larger than partisan politics. Democratic members, particularly those in the Congressional Black Caucus, displayed a range of emotions from solemn acknowledgement to barely contained passion. One senior congresswoman dabbed discreetly at the corner of her eye, the personal weight of Crockett's words evidently striking a chord that transcended political performance. Representative Crockett's posture changed subtly as she entered the final phase of her address. Her shoulders, which had maintained a rigid determination throughout, now seemed to draw strength from some invisible source, perhaps from the heritage she invoked, perhaps from the colleagues surrounding her, perhaps from the millions of Americans she knew were watching and depending on her words to give voice to their experiences. "I stand here a proud Black woman," she stated, the declaration both simple and revolutionary in a chamber that, for most of the nation's history, had been exclusively populated by white men, and a proud member of the Congressional Black Caucus. This dual identity, personal and collective, established her as both an individual speaking her truth and a representative of a larger community and historical tradition of resistance. The chamber had grown remarkably still. Even those who had entered, determined to dismiss her words, found themselves listening. If not in agreement, then at least in recognition of the moment's significance. Power in politics often resides in the ability to define the terms of debate, and Crockett had successfully shifted the conversation from policy minutiae to fundamental questions of justice and historical continuity. "I refuse to stand by while this administration tries to turn back the hands of time," she continued, her voice now carrying an unmistakable note of determination that resonated through the chamber. The metaphor of time being forcibly reversed captured perfectly what she viewed as the regressive nature of the administration's agenda, not moving America forward but dragging it backward toward darker chapters of its history. "We will resist," she promised. And the "we" expanded beyond herself, beyond the Congressional Black Caucus, beyond even the Democratic Party, to encompass all those throughout American history who had stood against injustice. We will continue speaking truth to power. The phrase, born in Quaker activism and adopted by the Civil Rights Movement, connected her stand to a long tradition of moral witness against abuses of authority. And we will keep organizing until everybody is free. The promise contained both acknowledgement of how much work remained and an unshakable commitment to continue that work regardless of obstacles. When she quoted Fannie Lou Hamer, "Nobody's free until everybody's free," she placed herself within a lineage of Black women who had fought for freedom not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality for all Americans. "I yield back," she concluded, the formal parliamentary language a stark contrast to the passionate commitment that had preceded it. As she stepped back from the podium, the technical end of her time to speak, something remarkable happened. The silence that followed was not the usual immediate shuffle of papers and whispered conversations that typically marked transitions between speakers. Instead, a moment of weighted consideration hung in the air, as if the chamber itself needed time to absorb what had just transpired. The camera lingered on Crockett's face as she returned to her seat, capturing an expression not of exhaustion after an emotional address, but of resolved determination. This had not been performance, but purpose. As she accepted quiet acknowledgments from colleagues, her eyes remained focused, already looking beyond this moment to the continued struggle she had promised to wage. As Representative Crockett took her seat, the formal proceedings of the House continued. But something had fundamentally shifted within the chamber. Words once spoken cannot be unheard. Truths once articulated cannot be easily dismissed. The C-SPAN cameras continued their mechanical documentation, but they could not fully capture the invisible currents now flowing through the historic space. Republican staffers could be seen huddled in small groups, their urgent whispers suggesting hasty revisions to prepared statements. Several Democratic members approached Crockett in the following moments, brief touches on the shoulder or whispered words of support conveying what formal decorum prevented them from expressing more openly. Outside the chamber, social media was already erupting with clips of the speech, particularly the powerful seed metaphor that encapsulated centuries of resistance in a single, indelible image. Hashtags formed and multiplied, digital echoes of what had transpired in that analog chamber of power. Within hours, these words would reach millions who would never set foot in the Capitol, but whose lives were profoundly affected by the decisions made within its walls. The true impact of moments like these cannot be measured in immediate political victories or defeats. They are evaluated in the courage they inspire, the consciousness they raise, the conversations they provoke. As the House moved on to other business, Crockett's words continued to reverberate. Not just through the physical space of the chamber, but through the national consciousness, challenging Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about their past, their present, and the future they wished to create. The seeds, indeed, had been planted. And as any gardener knows, what appears to be burial is often merely the necessary first step toward inevitable emergence, growth, and eventually, harvest. The question remaining was not whether these seeds would grow. History had proven their resilience time and again, but whether the nation would finally recognize that the freedom and justice they produced were not threats to be feared, but fruits to be collectively celebrated. In the battle for America's soul, Representative Jasmine Crockett had done more than deliver a speech. She had issued a reminder that democracy is not a fixed achievement, but a continuous process requiring constant vigilance, unflinching honesty, and an unwavering commitment to its highest ideals. The chamber might return to its normal rhythms, but the challenge she had laid before it, and before the nation, would not so easily be set aside. As the day's session continued, the light through the high windows gradually shifted, casting long shadows across the chamber floor. But in that moment of fading afternoon, something else had been cast as well. A vision of resistance, resilience, and ultimately, renewal. The seeds were planted. Now would come the growing.